That door had been locked for over 10 years. No one dared touch it until a 4-year-old boy whispered one night, "He can't sleep, Mommy. He's calling me." At first they thought it was sleep talking. Until one night the sound of dragging metal came from behind the door, and everything the boy had ever whispered turned out to be terrifyingly real. When they broke the lock and opened it, what they found inside shattered their world in tears and horror. Hit subscribe now so you never miss a single, true, breathtaking, and deeply emotional storytelling film from us. Perth, Western Australia. A horizon so wide, it could drown secrets for centuries. The coastline stretched with a tired elegance battered by the wind, pale sunlight trickling across the jagged rocks like a ghost too old to haunt. The house stood alone, weather-worn, faded cream paint peeling like old skin, a rusted mailbox, one shutter hanging at an angle swinging softly in the coastal breeze with a sound like an old breath remembering something it shouldn't. Ryan's pickup truck groaned to a stop outside. "Well, it's got character," he muttered, stepping out and shielding his eyes from the glare. Salt air hit his face, the scent of brine and decay. Leah followed her eyes, hollowed with exhaustion, hair tied back in a loose bun. She didn't say anything. She just opened the passenger door and unbuckled their son. "Come on, Oliver, we're here." The boy, 4 years old, with hair the color of damp sand and eyes too wide for comfort, looked up at the house and didn't smile. "Why is it sad?" he asked. Leah blinked. "What is, sweetheart?" He pointed with his little finger toward the upper windows. "The house. It looks sad." Ryan laughed softly, a hollow, papery sound. "Because it's empty, buddy." But not for long. They stepped inside. Floorboards creaked like sighs held too long. The air was stale. Dampness hugged the walls like something alive. Leah ran her fingers across the wallpaper. Floral prints faded into forgettable beige. The house had been listed for months, suspiciously cheap, but no buyers. No neighbors on either side for 3 lots. Just sand dunes and cicadas. Oliver wandered ahead. He wasn't running or bouncing the way toddlers usually do in new places. He moved slow, careful, as if the house had rules he already knew. In the center of the hallway, he stopped. The door was unlike the others, iron-framed, chipped blue paint, a brass handle that no longer shined. A large industrial-style padlock hung on it like a final word. Oliver tilted his head, then whispered almost too softly, "He's not sleeping." Leah turned. "What, honey?" Oliver didn't look at her. "There's a dog in there. He's not sleeping." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "There's nothing behind that door. Just storage or a pantry or something. Probably empty." Leah stepped closer to Oliver. "Why do you say that, baby?" Oliver's voice came again, quieter. "He's crying. Inside. But with no mouth. He wants to sleep, but he can't." A long silence. Ryan exhaled and knelt next to his son. "That's a strange thing to say, champ." Oliver finally looked at them. "He's waiting. For someone to open." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows just enough to make Leah flinch. She forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Oliver's face. "You've been reading too many spooky books with Grandma." "No, I haven't," he said, serious now. "It's real." Ryan stood nudging the padlock with his boot. "Well, if there's anything in there, it's dead by now, judging by the stink." And indeed, there was a faint odor. Mildew, mold, and something else. Something acrid, hidden beneath the surface. It lingered for a second, then seemed to vanish as the wind outside changed direction. They moved on. Leah tried to shake it off. New house, new start, she reminded herself. Boxes were unpacked. Plates rattled in cupboards. Oliver's room was painted pale blue, his stuffed rabbit placed on the windowsill like a sentry. Ryan carried boxes of archaeological journals into what would become his study. Leah sat on the porch for a moment, watched the sky roll in from the sea. It felt old out here, like everything had soaked in too many silences, the kind that pressed behind your ribs when the world got too still. Inside, Oliver hadn't moved far from that hallway. He sat just a few feet from the locked door, back against the wall, legs folded under him. He stared. She noticed him after sunset. "Sweetheart, come on, it's dinner time." Oliver didn't blink. "He's still awake," he whispered. "Who?" "The dog." Leah's throat tightened. "It's just a door, Ollie. There's nothing behind it. You're just a little nervous because the house is new, that's all." "No," he said more firmly. "He doesn't sleep. Ever." Leah walked over gently, picking him up. His little arms didn't wrap around her neck the way they usually did. They hung limp, and his head stayed tilted back, eyes locked on the door, even as she carried him away. That night, the wind howled. Old windows flexed. Floorboards cracked like knuckles. But none of it woke Leah. It was Oliver's scream that did. She shot upright, hard a drum. Ryan sat up beside her, confused. "What the?" Another scream. sharp, desperate, like something was being torn open. They burst into Oliver's room. He was curled in a ball under his blanket, sobbing, sheets soaked, face pale. "What is it, baby?" Leah cried, gathering him in her arms. He pointed to the door. He was scratching. "He wants out," he said. He said if I don't open it, he'll scream forever. Leah didn't respond. She just held him tighter. Ryan, half asleep, annoyed, walked to the hallway and flicked the light on. Nothing. Silence. "Nothing here," he muttered. "He had a nightmare. He's overtired." Leah didn't answer. She just watched Oliver's face. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't shaking. He was just listening, as if waiting for the sound to come again. The next morning, while unpacking the last of the kitchen items, Leah found something strange behind the broom closet, an old key, heavy, tarnished brass. No label, just a faint engraving, R11. She held it in her palm for a long moment. Later that day, she approached the locked door while Oliver napped on the couch. The key didn't fit. Whatever lock was on that door, it wasn't meant to be opened casually. Ryan told her again, "We'll get a locksmith next week if it matters that much. But it's probably empty. Or full of mold and rats." But Leah didn't hear him. She was watching Oliver, as his mouth twitched in sleep. A wince, a tremble. And from behind the door, just for a heartbeat, she thought she heard it too. A low wheezing sound. Not a growl, not a whimper, but something between the two. The wind had gone quiet that night. It was a kind of quiet Leah didn't like, heavy, expectant. As if the house itself was holding its breath. They had all gone to bed early. The move had taken its toll box, as does the fatigue of pretending to be fine. Ryan had fallen asleep quickly the way he always did. The kind of man who could put his head down and shut out the world in seconds. But Leah lay awake. She stared at the ceiling, its cracks forming rivers above her head. She blinked once, twice, and then she heard it, from down the hall. At first it was so faint she thought it was a dream, just a breeze through the eaves. But then again, a low, dragging sound, metal against wood, a breath, sharp, gritted, wet. Leah sat up. Ryan didn't stir. He was deep under. She listened again. Nothing now, just the throb of her own pulse in her ears. She padded barefoot down the hallway, every step slow and uncertain. Moonlight spilled across the floor in fractured pieces through the slats of the blinds. She passed Oliver's room. The door was cracked open. That's when she heard it clearer now. A small whimper, not animal, not human. Somewhere in between. She pushed open the door. Oliver was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, soaked with tears, breathing shallow, hands gripping his blanket like he was trying to hold onto the surface of the world. "Baby," she whispered. He shook his head fast and frightened. "He's calling me," he said. "He says he can't breathe." Leah's heart pinched. "Who, sweetheart? Who's calling you?" Oliver pointed toward the hallway, toward the door. He said if I don't open it, he'll keep crying, all night, forever. And just like that, the silence cracked again. It came from behind the metal door, so subtle she could have dismissed it if she wanted to. But she didn't. She stood there, eyes locked with her son's, and she knew. There was something in there, and it was awake. She held Oliver that night in the living room, curled on the couch, with a blanket wrapped around both of them. The old house creaked and groaned, like bones too long buried. By morning, Ryan was already up sipping burnt coffee and flipping through a stack of archaeological proposals. He glanced over his mug. Rough night. Leah didn't answer immediately. She studied Oliver asleep now, in her arms, his cheeks flushed, mouth slightly open. "He keeps hearing things," she said finally. "He thinks something's calling him." Ryan exhaled. "He's 4. He's exhausted. And you're still processing." The words dropped between them like ice. Still processing. That's what they'd called it. After the miscarriage. After Leah bled alone in a bathroom, silent, because Ryan had been on a dig in the desert and hadn't picked up his phone. She didn't answer him now. Just shifted her weight and carried Oliver to the guest room. She didn't want him sleeping alone. Not anymore. That night she tried to sleep. But again it came. A faint wheeze, a scraping, something like nails on plaster. She sat up in bed, heart kicking in her ribs. This time she got up without a word. She walked to the hallway and stood in front of the door. The air was colder there. Still, she leaned close, rested her ear against the metal. It was not the sea wind. It was breathing. And then she heard a voice, not with her ears, but somewhere deeper. It wasn't words, not exactly, but she understood it. "Let me out." She stepped back. No, it couldn't be. She was unraveling, that's all. She pressed her palm to her chest, trying to slow the tremor in her bones. Behind her, a small voice cut the air. "Mommy." She turned. Oliver was standing barefoot at the end of the hall. His eyes half-lidded, not quite awake. But his voice was clear. He said, "He'll start screaming if I don't come." Leah froze. And then Oliver dropped. He collapsed onto the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. No sound. No warning. She rushed to him, scooping him up. He was burning hot, his body limp. She called Ryan, her voice shaking. He took the boy, checked his pulse. He's just fevered. Probably the move, new environment. No, she snapped. It's not that. He's not just sick. He's terrified. Ryan looked at her. You're projecting again. And she snapped. I'm not. Don't you dare talk to me like I'm broken. He recoiled. Silence fell again. The house swallowed them. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night, Leah found Oliver lying on the hallway floor. His blanket, his pillow, his stuffed rabbit. Right in front of the door. She knelt beside him. Ollie, baby, what are you doing here? I can't sleep in my room, he whispered. He cries more when I'm far away. Leah felt her heart shatter. The boy was trembling. Tiny. Too young for this weight. I'm here now, she said. You don't have to listen alone. She lay beside him, her back against the wood of the door, her son nestled in her arms. And in the stillness, it came again. The sound. A long dragging breath. And this time words. He won't let me sleep. Her eyes burned. Not from fear, but from the ache of something too ancient to name. The next morning, Leah walked out to the backyard with a crowbar. She didn't tell Ryan. She didn't explain to Oliver. But she stared at the rusted padlock for a long time. She almost lifted the crowbar. Almost. Then she stopped. Some primal instinct made her drop it. Because from behind the door, she heard something else. Not breath, not scratches, but a single muffled sound. A bark. Low, broken, but real. She stepped back, and her knees gave out. Leah didn't sleep that night, not truly. She drifted. Floated through hours in fragments. Moments bled together. Oliver's shallow breathing, the rustling wind through cracked glass, and always that door. Standing like a wound in the hallway, never healing, never opening. By morning, her bones felt splintered. She dressed slowly, movements clumsy with exhaustion. The coffee maker sputtered. Ryan was already gone. He'd left early for a lecture across town. No goodbye. Oliver didn't wake with the sun. He didn't even stir. She let him sleep too, afraid of what he might say if he didn't. The light outside had turned to dusty white washed-out clouds, above the coast shadows soft as bruises. Leah stepped onto the porch. A breath of wind tugged at her cardigan. That's when she saw her. The old woman from next door, barely more than a silhouette through the swaying salt bush. She wore a long wool coat, mismatched slippers. Her silver hair gathered in a bun so loose it seemed to drift with the breeze. A faded scarf knotted around her throat. She moved like someone who had nothing left to rush toward. Leah had seen her a few times. From the kitchen window. Once in the driveway, dragging a bag of pet food larger than herself. But they'd never spoken. Today, though, something nudged Leah forward. She crossed the yard. The grass was brittle too long. A picket fence sagged in the middle like a tired spine. The gate creaked when she opened it. The old woman looked up. Morning, Leah offered cautious. A pause, then a dry smile. You're the new one. Leah nodded. Just moved in, last week. The woman turned back to her rosebush pruning without urgency. Her knuckles were red and twisted with arthritis. Old place. Old ghosts. Leah's throat tightened. Do you know who lived there before? The shears stopped mid-cut. A long silence followed. Then used to be the Hartleys. Hartley, Clive and Doreen. Married 30 years? Never saw them apart until the end. What happened? The old woman Myrtle, as Leah would soon learn, lowered her shears. Her eyes didn't move from the rose bush. She had a dog. Big one, ugly thing. Blacker than coal. Muzzle like a wolf. Leah's skin prickled. She used to say it talked to her. Not with words. With knowing. You understand? I don't think so. No, you wouldn't. Myrtle finally looked up. Her eyes were startlingly clear. But I believed her. Leah swallowed hard. What happened to the dog? Myrtle stared into the branches. It disappeared. Same day she did. Leah froze. She went missing. Police came. Said she ran. But I never believed that. No note, no fight, no clothes gone. Just gone. Myrtle's voice thinned. He said she'd snapped, that she'd taken the dog with her and vanished into the bush. But the man was strange, cold like winter stone. He never once looked for her. A pause. I saw him once out back, digging, not for plants. Leah felt a chill trace her spine. After he died stroke or karma, I hoped they'd tear that house down. But no. People came. People left. Nobody stayed long. Leah was quiet for a long time. Did anyone ever hear things from the house? Myrtle's smile was bitter. If they did, they kept it quiet. Like everyone does around here. Leah thanked her and walked back slowly. The wind had picked up. The sea smelled stronger, sharper. Back inside, Oliver was awake but distant. He sat at the kitchen table drawing. His crayon scraped the paper with nervous intensity. Leah poured juice, slid it toward him. "What are you making?" He didn't look up. The page was filled with black lines, sharp ones, jagged strokes. It wasn't a dog. It was the idea of one eyes like holes, body twisted mouth covered in red X's. "He can't bark," Oliver said quietly. Leah crouched beside him. "Who told you that?" "He did." He pointed toward the hallway. He said his voice was taken. That night, Leah couldn't ignore it anymore. When Ryan came home, she told him everything. Myrtle, the missing woman, the story of the dog. He didn't yell, didn't laugh. He just looked tired. "That woman's in her 90s, Leah. You're chasing shadows from someone else's grief." She turned away. Ryan sighed. "Look, I get it. You're under stress, but we need stability. For him." "Then help me," she snapped. "Help me figure out what the hell is going on behind that door." His silence was answer enough, so she went to the hardware store alone, bought a motion-sensitive baby cam. One with night audio and infrared. The clerk offered to install it. She declined. That night, while Ryan slept, and Oliver dozed uneasily in her bed, Leah set the camera up across from the door. She angled it low, taped the wires to the wall, pressed the red button. Recording. The red light blinked like a heartbeat. She sat beside it for a while, legs folded under her. Nothing happened. Nothing ever did when she watched. So she went back to bed, head swimming with questions. Morning. She woke to the sound of static. The camera was still recording. She pressed stop, pulled the SD card, slid it into her laptop. Hours of silence. She clicked through the footage, fast forward, frame by frame. Then 3:27 a.m. The hallway went from still to something else. She slowed it down. There, just past the 2-minute mark. A sound, so faint the waveform barely shifted. She turned the volume up. It came again. Not a growl, not a whimper, a bark, muffled, guttural, like someone barking through a soaked rag. She leaned closer, hard in her throat. Another sound followed. A scratch. No, not on wood, on metal. A desperate scrape, claw on iron. Then, silence again. But that was enough. Leah sat frozen, tears blurring the screen. She wasn't losing her mind. She was being told something. She backed the footage up, played it again. The bark wasn't threatening. It was pleading. The morning light slanted across the kitchen floor in narrow, cautious lines. No warmth, only a pale, indifferent glow. Oliver sat at the table again, his back stiff, eyes fixed on the paper in front of him. He didn't speak. Didn't ask for breakfast. He just drew. Leah poured herself a half cup of coffee and didn't drink it. She stood behind him, watching the strokes of his crayon move, not playfully, not carelessly, but slow, deliberate, as if copying something he had memorized in detail. He used only 2 colors, black and red. The shape on the page was unmistakable. A large dog body, curled awkwardly, 4 legs, bound tightly with red bands. Its mouth covered with a single bold red X. The eyes were empty ovals. Beneath it, he had scribbled words, uneven and shaking. "He can't talk." Leah knelt beside him, voice steady though her hands trembled. "Sweetheart, what is this?" Oliver blinked once. Then he turned to her, his small face drawn in that unreadable way she hated. "Too quiet, too old." "It's Whisper," he said. Leah's breath caught. "Whisper, that's his name. He told me. In the dream." Leah held the paper, felt its edges curl under her fingers, like something trying to recoil. "What happened to him, Ollie?" The boy pointed to the drawing. "That." She nodded, trying to keep her voice calm. "Why is his mouth?" Oliver didn't hesitate. "So he wouldn't wake the man." Leah blinked. "What man?" Oliver shook his head. "The bad one. He didn't want Whisper to bark, so he made it stop." Leah swallowed. The coffee went cold behind her. She looked at her son, at the shadows under his eyes, the stillness in his posture, the way his fingers pressed down on the red crayon until it snapped. He was unraveling, piece by piece. She rose, pacing the kitchen in small circles. Her thoughts flickered Myrtle's story, the bark caught on camera, the nightly scratching, the way her son no longer slept in his room. She stopped in front of the window, stared out at the restless sea. She knew what came next. Therapy, evaluations, a child psychologist. But something inside her resisted. It wasn't denial. It was instinct. Something about all of this felt real. Too precise, too raw. Still, she called the clinic. Booked an appointment for Friday, 4 days from now. That was all she could allow, just 4 more nights. That evening, Ryan came home with sand in his boots and a distant expression on his face. He greeted Oliver, kissed Leah's cheek out of habit. His presence was quiet but heavy, like he was already halfway back out the door. Leah waited until Oliver was in bed before she showed him the drawing. He studied it, frowning. "This is disturbing." He said the dog told him his name was Whisper. Ryan raised a brow. "Like a ghost story." "Like a cry for help," Leah answered. Ryan dropped the drawing on the counter. He needs professional help, Leah. We both know that. I've already booked an appointment. Good, but I'm also telling you, something else is happening here. His silence was sharp. Leah stepped closer. Ryan, there are sounds, real sounds. The footage picked them up. A bark, claws on metal. This isn't just him. It's not just me. Ryan didn't look at her. Do you know what stress does to memory? To perception? You've been through hell. Maybe we both have. But turning this into a ghost hunt isn't helping him. Or us. Leah's voice dropped. It's not a ghost, Ryan. It's something alive. He stared at her, not angry, just tired, and maybe a little afraid. Later that night, the wind returned sharper than before, rattling the window panes, like bones knocking in rhythm. Leah and Ryan lay in bed back to back. Silence between them stretched wide and cold. Then it came, at first faint, but real. A scraping, rhythmic, slow, metal on wood. Leah sat up instantly. Her skin broke out in goosebumps. Did you hear that? Ryan said nothing. Then it happened again. This time louder, like something being dragged, something heavy. From behind the locked door, Leah bolted from the bed. Ryan cursed under his breath, throwing the sheets back. They moved down the hallway together. No flashlight, no camera, just adrenaline and dread. The house felt smaller, the air thick, the hallway longer than before. They reached the door. Silence. The sound had stopped. Leah leaned in. From the other side, a breath. And then 3 deliberate knocks. Soft, measured, waiting. Ryan stepped back. No, he whispered. That's not possible. Leah's voice shook. We have to open it. No, we don't. Whatever's in there, it's been there too long. That's exactly why we have to, they argued. Low voices, desperate tones. But the door remained shut. Later that night, Leah found Oliver awake. He sat upright in bed, staring toward the door at the end of the hall. It's hurting now, he whispered. The ropes are tight. He says it hurts. Leah's voice broke. I know, baby. I know. He looked up at her. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't cry. I think if I go near the door, it'll stop hurting. Leah held him close. No, she said. No, sweetheart. You don't open it. Not alone. The rest of the night passed without sleep. When morning came, Leah didn't make coffee. She didn't pack Oliver's lunch. She just stood in front of that door staring at it for a long time. Something was changing, and she could feel it, like a pressure building behind her ribs. Someone was running out of time. The door had become a heartbeat. Constant. Audible only to those who feared it. Leah stood before it every morning, with the camera unplugged, the hallway light flickering with no pattern. She didn't speak to it, didn't touch it. She just listened. For breath, for movement, for the sound of something that should not be alive, still struggling behind a wall of iron and neglect. Ryan had stopped asking, but that didn't mean he wasn't watching. That morning over breakfast, no one touched Ryan, placed his mug down harder than he meant to. The sound cracked through the silence. Enough, he said. Leah didn't look up. Enough of what? The door, the stories, the damn whispering at night. Oliver is getting worse. And you, he pointed at her with a trembling finger. You're feeding it. She stared at him, eyes sunken, voice flat. Feeding what? The paranoia. The obsession. You're turning this house into something it isn't. Leah's mouth twitched. Tell that to the thing scratching every night. There's no thing, he snapped. There's trauma. There's projection. There's a child who watches his mother kneel in front of a locked door like it's a shrine to grief. Leah stood up slowly. Don't talk to me about grief. Then stop using it like a compass. Oliver, silent in his chair, dropped his spoon. Leah walked over and picked it up. Her son didn't react. His eyes were open, but not awake. She could see it again, the bruising under his eyes, the sallow skin, the way he swayed slightly, even when still. He hadn't slept through a single night in 6 days. He's not pretending, Ryan, she whispered. He wakes up screaming, begging me to save it. Ryan crossed his arms. He's mirroring you. You're unraveling and he sees it. You're teaching him that pain lives behind that door. And now he believes it too. Leah turned her back to him, her hand instinctively pressing against the wall just beside the doorframe. It was cold, colder than the rest of the house. That night, Oliver screamed again. Leah was there in seconds. He was clawing at his blanket's feet, kicking, eyes wide open, but unseeing. Mom, Mom. He's choking. He can't breathe. He can't. His body arched. Leah held him, rocked him, whispered into his sweat-matted hair. I'm here. You're safe. Ryan entered the room seconds later, breathing hard, face pale. But he didn't come closer. He just stood in the doorway, watching. That's when Oliver opened his eyes and stared directly at Leah. You have to open it, he whispered. His voice wasn't frantic. It was calm, resigned. Or he'll die. Ryan had heard it. And still the next morning, he came home from work early. Leah was folding Oliver's pajamas when she heard the metallic click echo from the hallway. She turned the corner fast. Ryan was crouched in front of the door, sweat on his brow, a small toolbox beside him. But instead of removing the lock, he was replacing it. She stood frozen. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer at first. His hands moved with quiet efficiency. New padlock, reinforced, heavy. The key disappeared into his pocket. Leah stepped closer. "Ryan." Still no answer. "Ryan." He stood, eyes avoiding hers. "This ends now." She stared at the lock. It was twice the size of the old one. Thicker chain, welded hinges. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "Because I love you," he said. "And I'm not losing you to whatever fantasy you've built around this house. You need help. We all do." She laughed then, a broken, humorless sound. "You think chaining it up is going to fix this? I think chaining you out is the only way I know to get our son back." Leah pressed a hand to her forehead. Her skin was ice. "You're locking it tighter when every night it begs to be opened?" "It's not begging, Leah. It's you. You're the one begging." Later, Leah sat on the porch with her coat wrapped tight, watching the seafoam curl toward the shore. Myrtle came by again, wordless, sat beside her. After a long silence, Myrtle said, "He locked it." Leah nodded. New padlock, stronger. The old woman didn't respond right away. Then, almost as a whisper, she said, "It won't help. That lock is just a denial. And denial rots slower than corpses, but it stinks worse when it finally breaks." Leah looked at her. "What if it's not just an animal?" she asked. Myrtle lit a cigarette, though her hands trembled. "No ghost I've ever heard needed to breathe," she said. "That thing in there, it's old, but it ain't dead." That night, Oliver didn't speak. He curled up on the hallway floor again, eyes open, staring at the new lock like it had personally betrayed him. "He's mad now," he said softly. "He says he can't wait anymore." Leah knelt beside him. "I'll fix it." Oliver blinked. "How?" "I don't know, but I will." She waited until Ryan was asleep. Then she took the flashlight, the old crowbar, and the original camera. But when she reached the hallway, her heart stopped. The lock was different again, not just thicker, different. Someone had switched it, not replaced, upgraded. The chain was bolted directly into the frame now. The hinges soldered shut. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. Leah sank to the floor, cold steel in front of her, a wall of weight pressing against her chest. She didn't cry, she just whispered, "I'm sorry, I should have come sooner." And from behind the door, something shifted, not loud, not sharp, but distinct. A rustle, a sigh, a sound like rope tightening. And underneath it, a voice. Not a bark, not human, but something between. He's still waiting. The wind had dropped by morning. That eerie silence again, the kind that didn't comfort, but pressed against the walls, like water against a cracked hull. The sea outside didn't rage. It waited, like everything else. Ryan left just after dawn, slinging his laptop bag over his shoulder, muttering something about a grant meeting and a campus delay. Leah didn't hear the rest. She watched the keys in his hand. Watched him lock the hallway cabinet with the reinforced padlock tools inside. Watched him pocket the key. She waited until she heard the tires grind against the gravel and disappear into the hum of the coast road. Then she moved, not like someone rushing, like someone finally letting go. She walked into the kitchen, moved the cereal box aside, opened the drawer beneath the spice rack. The spare key to the hallway cabinet was exactly where she'd seen him hide it 2 weeks ago, before things got strange. She took the bolt cutter, heavy, cold, the crowbar from under the sink, the one with rust where time had forgotten to look away. She turned and found Oliver in the hallway. He didn't flinch, didn't ask. He looked at the tools in her arms and said quietly, "He's waiting." She nodded. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Me too." He walked beside her without being asked. The house was so quiet, every step sounded like a choice. They reached the door. The chain gleamed bright and cruel. The padlock stared at her like an eye. Leah raised the bolt cutter and paused. Oliver was staring straight ahead, still as stone. Then his lips moved. "I'll count," he said. "If you don't open it by the end, he won't breathe anymore." Leah blinked, throat tightening. "Ollie." 1. She positioned the jaws around the lock. 2. Her arms trembled from the weight of steel, of time, of fear. 3. With a roar from inside her ribs, Leah crushed the handles together. The padlock snapped with a violent clink. The chain sagged like it exhaled. She dropped the bolt cutter and gripped the crowbar, jammed it into the crack where metal met frame. The door groaned. Once, twice, then again with the scream of rust tearing apart. The latch exploded off its bolt and hit the ground, and the door opened. A smell hit her first. Rot. Wetness. Mold layered over something darker, like old blood, copper, and bile. Years of breathless waiting. The room wasn't large, but it felt endless. A storage space. Walls lined with rotting shelves. Water-stained wallpaper curled like peeling skin. The air moved like something living. And in the far corner, a shape. Leah stepped forward. No sound. Oliver didn't follow. He stood at the threshold, hand against the wall, whispering, "He's there." Leah moved closer. Then she saw it. At first it looked like a sack or a pile of blankets. But as she drew closer, it shifted. A leg, another, thin, matted with black fur turned gray with dust and time. A snout, motionless, eyes barely open. A black dog, bound, wire wrapped around all four legs, twisted so tight it had broken the skin. Its mouth sealed shut with 3 layers of electrical tape. Dried blood on the edges. Its chest barely rose. Leah dropped the crowbar. "Oh my God." She dropped to her knees. "Whisper," she said. The eyes moved. Not fast, not afraid, just tired. Leah reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand on its side. The rib cage shuddered under her palm. "Alive." "Hold on," she whispered. "I'm here." She yanked the tape from its mouth. The dog didn't cry, didn't even whimper, just exhaled. Then its head collapsed into her lap. Footsteps, small. Oliver knelt beside her. His hand rested on the dog's back. "See?" he said softly. "He's not screaming anymore." Tears spilled down Leah's cheeks. "How long has it been in here?" she whispered. Oliver shook his head. "Too long." She unwrapped the wires from its legs. The skin beneath was raw, bleeding. Leah pulled off her sweater, wrapped it around the dog's body, lifted it slowly. It didn't fight. Didn't even twitch. Ryan's voice shattered the silence. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned. He stood in the hallway, keys in hand, face pale. "I told you," he began. "Don't," Leah snapped. Her voice had no tremble. He moved toward them. "You broke into that room." Leah stared at him. "You locked a living creature in there." "That's not a creature," he barked. "That's a hallucination you forced onto our son. A projection of everything we've lost. It's real." Oliver stood. His voice didn't shake. "He's real, and he's hurting." Ryan looked at the dog. For the first time, he seemed to really see it. His breath caught. "How?" he muttered. This isn't possible." "It doesn't matter," Leah said. "What matters is he's still alive." Ryan staggered backward. His knees hit the wall. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I think you did," Leah said coldly. "You just didn't want it to be true." She carried the dog past him. Oliver followed. They walked outside, into the morning light. The air outside hit like a slap, briny, thick, harsh, with early light. The house behind them still seemed to breathe, like a thing waking up after a long, dark sleep. Leah staggered across the porch. Whisper in her arms, his body limp, wrapped in her torn sweater, his breath barely there. She could feel his ribs through the thin fur, sharp as twigs. His eyes were open, but dulled gray, distant, ancient. Each step felt heavier. Not from the weight of the dog, but from the realization clawing into her mind, he should not be alive. Not after days, not after years. Oliver trailed close, silent, one hand on her elbow. The other still smudged with crayon red from the drawing he made 2 days earlier. The wind moved around them in gusts, but nothing felt clean. Nothing felt new. In the driveway, Leah collapsed to her knees. The dog's body slid gently from her arms onto the dry, cracked gravel. That's when the smell hit her full force. It wasn't just rot. It was filth, feces, dried urine, infection. A slow, steady leak of waste that had nowhere else to go. Her stomach lurched. She turned to the grass and vomited. Behind her, Oliver knelt, brushing the dog's fur with tiny fingers, whispering something only the animal could hear. His voice cracked mid-sentence, and then the tears came. They were sharp, fast, unstoppable. "He's tired now," Oliver sobbed. "He doesn't want to make noise anymore." Leah wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve, crawled back to the dog's side. Its breath came in short, shuddering pulses. Foam clung to the edge of its mouth. Blood crusted around where the tape had been torn. And then somehow, worse than all of it, the skin beneath the fur raw, chafed clean in circles where wire had cut deep. Some of the wounds looked old, others looked fresh. There were places where bone pressed against the surface, black spots, necrosis, and yet it breathed. Leah's voice cracked. No one could survive this. No one, no thing. She touched the dog's chest again gently and felt a rattling beneath her fingers. The kind of sound lungs shouldn't make. That's when Ryan stepped out onto the porch. He didn't speak, not at first. He looked at the scene before him, like a man trying to wake up from a dream already bleeding into nightmare. He saw the dog. He saw the wire. He saw his wife on her knees, trembling hands covered in blood and dirt and fur. And he said nothing, because what could he say? "I didn't know," he whispered. Leah didn't look at him. "Don't," she rasped. "Don't say that." She stood slowly, her knees shaking. "You sealed that room." Ryan's voice was small. "I thought it wasn't real." Oliver's cry cut the silence like a blade. It was real. It was real the whole time. His tiny frame curled against the animal, clutching its neck like it might vanish. He was screaming and no one listened. Ryan staggered back. His hand moved to his mouth. "We need help," he mumbled. He needs medical. No, Leah interrupted. He needs out of here. She lifted Whisper again, arms screaming in pain. The smell clung to her skin, to her throat. She didn't care. She walked past Ryan like he wasn't there, like he was part of the rot. She made it to the car, shoved open the back door. Whisper barely moved as she laid him on a towel. Oliver slid in beside him without question, without fear. They drove. Leah's hands gripped the wheel like she was steering a ship through a storm. Every part of her buzzed, terror-fury heartbreak, all bleeding into each other. The vet's office was quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. The receptionist looked up from behind the desk, eyes falling on the scene. A woman soaked in blood and rust, a boy cradling a dog that looked like it had been pulled from a grave. No questions. She buzzed the back door and yelled for the emergency team. 4 minutes later, Whisper was on a metal table under white lights. The vet, a small man with wiry gray hair, began examining him. Leah stood frozen by the door. Oliver gripped her hand so tightly her fingers went numb. The vet muttered to his assistant, "This can't be right." What Leah rasped. These wounds, they're in multiple states of healing. Some are recent. Some are at least a year old. But this animal is... He hesitated. "Ma'am, this dog shouldn't be alive." Leah's eyes burned. He is. But he's dehydrated beyond reason. Malnourished. Internal bleeding. He's literally saturated in ammonia. There's urine damage on his skin, for God's sake. He drank from the wall, Oliver whispered. The leak. That's what kept him. The vet stared at the boy, and something in his face shifted. He didn't understand, but he believed. They sedated Whisper, hooked him to fluids, wrapped the raw legs, applied cream, oxygen, monitors. Hours passed. Leah sat with her head in her hands, not crying, past crying, just breathing. Oliver curled on the bench, finally asleep, his hand still wrapped in Whisper's ear fur. Then came the knock at the door. 2 officers, clean shirts, clipboards, quiet questions. Leah told them everything, not the dreams, not the whispers, but the facts. The room, the lock, the smell, the dog, the wire. They didn't interrupt, didn't blink much either. "Where's the dog now?" one asked. "In surgery," the other nodded. "We'll need access to the property." Leah handed them the keys. Later, when she returned home, the police were already in the hallway. The door stood open. Photos being taken. Evidence bags. Myrtle stood across the lawn watching, eyes wet, head bowed. An officer approached Leah. "We'll need a statement from your husband." Leah's voice was gravel. "He's not home." "Where is he?" She didn't answer. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe she didn't care. She walked into the room, saw the stains on the floor, the torn wires, the puddle of filth in the corner where Whisper had been forced to relieve himself again and again, waiting for a voice to call his name. Leah covered her mouth, dropped to her knees, and screamed. Not from fear, not from shock, from guilt. Because the worst part wasn't what they'd found. It was that she'd waited too long. The following morning, the sky over Perth had darkened. A thick brackish haze hung over the shoreline, like smoke from a fire that hadn't burned yet. Leah stood barefoot on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around her middle. The house behind her no longer felt like a home. It felt like a question mark someone had buried under floorboards and lies. Across the road, the screen door creaked. Myrtle stepped out slowly, carrying a chipped mug of tea. She moved like someone used to weight of memory, of silence, of things no one else wanted to carry. Her slippers scraped the concrete path as she crossed over without invitation. Leah didn't stop her. They stood side by side, watching nothing. After a long moment, Myrtle said, "The police were here late last night." Leah nodded. "They say the dog lived in that room. Years, maybe. The floor was soaked through, wood eaten black. They found human hair in the drain." Another nod. "Child Services called me this morning," Leah said softly. "Asked about Oliver, if he showed signs of trauma. They don't know whether to call this a crime scene or a miracle." Myrtle exhaled through her teeth. "It's both." Silence stretched again. Then Leah turned to the older woman. "You knew, didn't you?" Myrtle's face didn't change. But something inside her posture, her breath shifted. Braced. "I knew enough to stay quiet," she said. Leah's voice was low. "Tell me everything." Myrtle's gaze drifted toward the dunes. Then, like a story finally too heavy to hold, she let it go. "The woman who lived here before you. Her name was Doreen Hartley. I only knew her by first name. Quiet type. Fragile. You could tell from the way she walked, like someone expecting a blow." Leah didn't interrupt. "They moved here together, Doreen and Clive. Looked like a normal couple from the outside. But anyone who's lived long enough knows how normal can rot." She took a sip of tea. He was the controlling kind. Loud in private, charming in public. She'd wear long sleeves in the heat. Always had an excuse, burned myself on the kettle. brushed against a doorframe. But you knew. Leah closed her eyes. Then one day, Myrtle continued, they brought home a dog. Big thing, black as pitch. Scared the hell out of every kid on the street. But not her. She treated it like it was made of glass, called it Whisper. Said it was the only thing that ever listened. A bird called in the trees behind them. Neither of them looked. She changed after that. Not braver, but less alone. You could see it. She started walking him late at night, around the block, never when Clive was home. And then Leah whispered. Then the screaming started. We heard it through the walls. Not hers, his. Said the damn dog bit him. Claimed it was dangerous, vicious. But no one saw a mark on him. Myrtle looked down at the tea in her hands. Next day, animal control came. They said they'd received an anonymous call. Dangerous breed. History of aggression. They were going to seize him. Doreen didn't let them in. Leah's breath hitched. They never came back. But a few weeks later, she stopped showing up altogether. No walks, no garden, nothing. And Clive, he was out there mowing the lawn like nothing happened, smiling at the neighbors, taking out the trash. Leah's mouth went dry. Didn't anyone report her missing? Myrtle nodded. I did. So did a few others. But he told the police she'd gone back east. Family emergency. Claimed she'd taken the dog. Even showed them a suitcase in the hallway. And they believed him. They wanted to. Leah's voice shook. What happened to him? Heart attack. Year later. Alone in the living room. No one found him for 2 days. Myrtle looked at Leah, then her eyes flint. When they cleared the house, no one opened that room. It was locked. Padlocked. And the new owners didn't ask. Leah's breath came faster. So Whisper was in there this whole time. Myrtle nodded. They sealed it up, cleaned the walls. But no one stayed long. The house held on to things. Leah stared down at her hands. They still bore traces of dried blood under the nails. I thought I was going mad, she whispered. I thought the crying was in my head. No, sweetheart, Myrtle said. It wasn't. It was just left behind. A car pulled into the driveway. Unmarked, dark blue. 2 officers stepped out. Leah knew them now. Detective Harris and Constable Rao. Tired eyes, steady voices. They walked up slowly, and Harris held out a folder. We found something, he said. Leah took it with trembling hands. Inside photocopies, records, scans of old intake forms, digital evidence logs. One name came up again and again. Whisper, male, 38 kilograms, mixed breed, possibly Mastiff Lab. Date of birth, unknown. Owner Doreen Hartley. Date of reported aggression, October 14th, 2011. Classification level 3. Potentially dangerous animal. Pending destruction order. Leah blinked at the last page. Handwritten notes in shaky pen. Attempted to enter premises. Owner refused access. Dog did not show aggression. Neighbor reports conflicting account. Recommend observation. Stamped case closed. No further action taken. Harris pointed at the file. We're still digging through what's left. But this confirms it. He was flagged for destruction. Never removed from the home. Never seen again. And the woman Leah asked. Still listed as missing person. Voluntary departure. No foul play ever proven. No body found. Leah closed the folder slowly. They left him to die. Harris nodded. That dog survived 11 years in a locked room. If the forensic timeline holds, someone was still feeding him years after she vanished, possibly until the old man died. Leah felt her knees wobble. He lived on leaks in the wall, on his own waste, in complete darkness. His lungs are scarred. His stomach's collapsed. But the vet says his heart is strong, still fighting. Oliver came to the door then. He didn't say anything, just stood in the light, looking at the folder, at the officers, at his mother, and then in the smallest voice, Can we keep him now? Leah crouched down, eyes filling again. She opened her arms and held her son like he was the only soft thing left in the world. The first 24 hours after surgery were critical. Whisper's condition was fragile organs. Starved, skin-inflamed lungs, congested from years of stagnant air and ammonia exposure. The vet, Dr. Renner, had pulled Leah aside and said the words no one ever wants to hear. He might not make it. But Whisper wasn't ready to leave. He slept under a heating lamp. His body wrapped in medicated gauze tubes connected to fluid lines. His heartbeat a slow, deliberate rhythm on the monitor. Oliver sat beside him for hours, sometimes sketching, sometimes whispering stories, sometimes just staring in silence. It was the first time in weeks the boy looked calm, not cured, but unburdened. That night, Leah finally fell asleep. Not on the couch, not beside the door, but in her bed, next to Ryan. No words passed between them when she climbed in. No apologies. Just space, presence. A breath shared between two people who had forgotten how to hold one another. At 3:14 a.m., Leah woke from a dreamless sleep and realized something strange. Silence. No scratching. No breath behind walls. No cold draft under the door. Just stillness. She sat up. Ryan stirred beside her. "What is it?" he mumbled. "I don't hear him." Ryan blinked. Then his eyes widened. They both stood at once, rushing to Oliver's room. He was asleep. Truly asleep. Curled into a fetal ball, face relaxed. Breath deep and even. His stuffed rabbit clutched to his chest. No sweat on his brow. No twitching fingers. No whispering in the dark. Leah stood at the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. The hallway behind her no longer felt haunted. It just felt empty. In the days that followed, Whisper began to heal slowly, painfully. He opened his eyes more often. Ate soft food in small bites. Learned to trust hands again. He never barked. Not once. But he leaned into touch. He wagged his tail barely but deliberately whenever Oliver entered the room. The vet marveled at his resilience. "I've seen dogs survive rough conditions," he told Leah. "But not like this. Not for this long. And not with this kind of calm. It's like he was waiting." Leah didn't answer. She already knew. They brought him home after 2 weeks. Not because he was fully recovered, he wasn't. But because every hour in a clinic cage chipped away at something deeper. Whisper didn't want fluorescent lights or antiseptic smells. He wanted sunlight. He wanted Oliver. Ryan helped carry him inside, laying him gently on the soft bed they'd placed in the corner of the living room. Leah watched them. Her husband and the dog he once refused to believe existed, moving together in quiet coordination. Later, when Oliver lay beside Whisper with his hand resting on the animal's scarred flank, Leah turned to Ryan. "I didn't know if we'd ever get him back." Ryan nodded. "I didn't know if we'd get you back." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Leah whispered, "I was angry. For a long time. I know. I blamed you. I know that too." She looked at him. "But I blamed myself more." Ryan reached out not for her hand, but for her shoulder. A light touch. A beginning. "You didn't lock the door," he said. "You opened it." Their healing didn't come in one sweeping gesture. It came in small things. The way Ryan learned to mix Whisper's medication into his food. The way Leah let herself lean into his shoulder during long nights of cleaning wounds. The way Oliver laughed, truly laughed, when Whisper licked his face for the first time. They found rhythm again. Not the one they had before. A new one, built from silent scars and shared survival. Whisper never left the living room. Not at first. He liked the windows, the breeze, the sound of leaves brushing against the glass. At night, he would lift his head whenever Oliver passed by for a glass of water. Just enough to say, "I'm here." The door in the hallway stayed open. Not once did anyone close it. It was empty now, but Leah sometimes caught herself standing just outside it. Not afraid, just remembering. The darkness that once lived there was gone, but the memory wasn't. One afternoon, Oliver brought Leah a new drawing. She braced herself, expecting darkness, but the paper held light. In it, a black dog lay on a green hill. A small boy sat beside him, holding a leash. In the background, a woman and man stood with arms around each other, watching from a distance. There was no sky, just white space above. But in the corner, in shaky but confident letters, Oliver had written, "He's not whispering anymore. He's sleeping. He's home." Leah cried in the kitchen for the first time in days. She cried because the house was quiet, and because for the first time that didn't mean something terrible. It meant peace. Leah sat at the kitchen table with the morning light slanting across her laptop. The old kettle hissed softly behind her, but she didn't move to turn it off. The cursor blinked. Her hands hovered over the keys, then settled. She began to write. Not an essay, not a polished piece of memoir, just a telling. Raw, uncertain, unfinished. It began the way stories never should. There was a locked door. We left it shut because we were told to. As she typed, memories spilled out not chronologically, but viscerally. The smell behind that door. The sound of Whisper's breathing when she first touched his chest. The way Oliver's drawings went from black to color, from screaming mouths to quiet fields. She didn't hold back. She wrote the things she couldn't say out loud, not just about the dog, but about herself. The silences between her and Ryan. The shame. The denial. The aching emptiness of a family that had crumbled inward until a boy and a dog became the only bridge left standing. She titled it, "The Whisper Behind the Door," and she hit post. It went to a small forum, an online group for survivors of animal abuse cases. Leah had joined it weeks earlier under a different name, reading other people's stories at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. She didn't expect much, but the first reply came an hour later, then another, and another. By evening, her inbox was full. A woman in Saskatchewan wrote, "I had a Rottweiler named Luna. She saved me from my ex. They put her down after. I still dream of her. Thank you for telling this. A man in Liverpool, I used to beat myself up for what I didn't see. But your story makes me think maybe some part of them survives waiting. That maybe waiting is strength. And then photos. Dozens. Dogs with scars. Cats missing legs. Horses with burn marks. Every image came with a sentence that began with shame and ended in light. Leah read until her eyes blurred. She closed the laptop and walked into the living room. Whisper lay on a fleece blanket near the window. His legs were stronger. Now he could walk from one room to the next without collapsing. His tail wagged slowly when she approached. One eye was still clouded, but the other followed her calm and soft. She knelt, touched the side of his face. "You've started something," she whispered. "And I don't think it's done yet." He licked her palm once. In the hallway, Oliver padded barefoot across the wooden floor, clutching his pillow under one arm. His hair was wild from sleep, but his eyes were clear. "Is he awake?" he asked. Leah nodded. "He's waiting for you." Oliver set his pillow down beside Whisper and sat cross-legged. The dog turned his head and rested his snout on the boy's knee. It had become their ritual every evening and after dinner. Oliver would lead Whisper to his room. The walk was slow. Sometimes Whisper would hesitate in dark doorways, frozen tail tucked. But Oliver never rushed him. He waited, let Whisper sniff, look, choose. And every night the dog came. They slept beside each other. No cages, no crates. Just trust. Leah had asked once, "Why do you still bring him with you?" "You're not scared anymore." Oliver looked up from his coloring book. "Because he still is." That answer had stayed with her. They weren't just healing Whisper. He was healing them. Ryan returned later that night. He smelled like dust and wind, and his eyes were rimmed with fatigue. He'd started volunteering twice a week at a local wildlife shelter. Not because he knew animals, but because he was trying to remember how to be useful without control. "How was today?" he asked, shrugging off his coat. Leah handed him a cup of tea. Quiet. He ate a full bowl of food. Ryan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Baby steps. He walked down the hallway, didn't flinch once. That stopped him. His smile deepened. "Did you tell him I'm proud of him?" "I did." Ryan took a sip and sat across from her. They didn't speak for a while. Then Leah opened the laptop again and turned it toward him. "People are writing to us." He scanned the messages, scrolling in silence. When he reached one that read, "You reminded me to listen to the doors." "I've left shut," he looked up. "This isn't just about Whisper," he said. No, Leah replied. It never was. They spent the evening answering replies together. They didn't use perfect grammar. They didn't try to be profound. Just human. And somewhere between the third and fourth message, Ryan reached over and touched her hand. It stayed there. The next morning, Whisper barked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frightened. It was a single low woof, as if testing the sound of his own voice in the daylight. Oliver's face lit up. He finally said something. Whisper wagged his tail. Once, Leah laughed an unfiltered, tear-soaked laugh she hadn't heard from herself in years. That night, Oliver crawled into bed beside Whisper and whispered, "You don't have to bark anymore, though. I know what you mean without it." He paused, then added, "I sleep now because you do." In the quiet, Whisper blinked, laid his head on the pillow, and closed his eyes. Outside the window, the wind shifted. No longer moaning, no longer dragging across the old siding with claws. Just breathing. The room had once been the coldest part of the house. Now, it was the warmest. It took them 2 weekends. The first was for clearing the rusted wire. The moldy tarp, the collapsed shelf, the dark stains soaked deep into the floorboards. Ryan ripped up the warped wood with bare hands until his palms bled. Leah didn't stop him. She worked beside him, peeling back layers of wallpaper like old skin layer after layer of decay, until only plaster and silence remained. Oliver watched from the hallway. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. But he stood there every hour like a witness. By the second weekend, they painted. Leah chose a color that didn't have a name. It was something between soft green and sea foam, the shade of calm after a storm. Whisper lay just outside the doorway, eyes half closed, tail twitching whenever the brush made a soft stroke against the wall. Oliver read to him mostly nonsense stories made up on the spot. And then the boy told the wind to go away, he said, and it did, because he finally wasn't afraid of it. Ryan installed a small window shelf to catch the light. Leah sewed a cushion by hand and placed it there with quiet reverence. The new floor was smooth pine, clean, empty of memory. They carried in a dog bed together, Oliver and Leah. Whisper followed, limping slightly, but determined. When they placed the bed in the center of the room, Whisper stepped into it without hesitation. He curled up, stretched once, then fell asleep. No whimpering, no twitching legs, just sleep. The old door didn't go back up. Ryan took it to the edge of the property and burned it. He didn't say anything while it cracked and folded in on itself, but he didn't look away either. Leah watched from the porch. not to make sure it was gone, but to acknowledge it once more, one final time. Later, when the wind came off the sea, it no longer howled through the hallway. No more dragging, no breath through the cracks. Just a breeze, ordinary, present. That night, Leah stood by the window of the room that used to be a prison. She rested one hand against the frame and looked out toward the water. The stars were out. The waves moved silver and slow, like someone breathing peacefully in sleep. Behind her, she heard the sound of paws on the floor. Whisper approached, looked at her, then stepped beside her and sat. She looked down. "You okay?" she whispered. He blinked. She smiled. "Me too." Oliver came in barefoot and sleepy-eyed, dragging a blanket. He climbed onto the cushion in the corner without a word. Whisper followed. Leah covered them both. Ryan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching quietly. "Did you ever think," he said softly, "that maybe the house was waiting too?" Leah didn't turn. She just said, "It's not anymore." He walked over, slid his hand into hers. And for a while, none of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The room no longer needed words. It had light. It had breath. It had forgiveness.